You're watching Fish Plates and Scratch Builds. I'm Jonathan, and by the end of this video, you'll be able to take track that looks something like this and turn it into track that looks something more like this. Let's find out how. I think as modelers, we all strive for that extra layer of realism. And today I'm going to show you some really simple tips to improve probably one of the biggest and most prominent elements on your layout, the track. One of the easiest things for me to tell you would be to go out and buy really expensive, proper, highly detailed track. But I'm not going to do that today because what I really want to do is try and make the hobby more accessible to more people. And I think that you can actually create some really stellar looking track work with even the most basic Code 100 track, which is pretty much what I'm going to be working with today. Okay, so tip number one is before you've even done anything, before you've even put your track down on the board, I want you to have a think about where you're going to lay it. This might be problematic for people depending on your layout, but I want you to think about laying the track at a different angle to the edge of the board. Now, it's really common, I think, when we start laying track to lay it with the straight pieces parallel with the edge. But what that does is it actually draws our eye to those straight lines, to that edge, and it just betrays the fact, I think, that it's a model and that it's not a real world. And you'll notice from this example here, when I lay it down, the interesting spaces it creates around the track, these little triangular areas, which are going to be more fun, I think, to fill in later. Tip number two. Now, this is something that you may want to do, you may not want to do. This one I would say is purely optional, but I really hope you see the big difference it makes. And that is modifying the spacing of your sleepers. I know this sounds really pedantic and really faffy, but I promise it makes a massive difference. Now, I've looked online and you can get all kinds of different 3D printed and laser cut gauges, which you can use to help you in this task because it can be quite monotonous. Now, if you're building a little diorama like I am here, it's going to be much easier because I've only got one single straight piece of track. And if you turn the track over, you'll notice that there's some webbing underneath which holds all the sleepers together. You can use a sharp craft knife to just literally cut through each of those pieces, and that frees up the sleepers. Now, if you're using Pico flexible track like I am here, these sleepers actually move really quite freely up and down the metal rails, making this much easier. And then it's just really a simple case of using one of these gauges, placing the track over the top and gently moving the sleepers into the spots on the gauge. Naturally, with increasing the spacing, there won't be room for all the sleepers. Pop those off the end of the rails, they come off really easily, and pop them aside because they're going to be really great for some details later on. Tip number three is all about how you attach your track to the board. For me, certainly when I was growing up and I was modelling, the classic way of sticking your track down was to use these track pins, tiny little pins which fit through pre-drilled holes in a lot of track work. And that's fine, isn't it? But what I've found when I've been taking realistic close-up photography of some of my models is that those tiny pins that we can't see with our naked eye become quite obtrusive when we look at them up close in a photo. Now, this may not bother you, and honestly, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't bother with this step. But what I personally prefer is to glue my track down. There's loads of different glues that you could use. You could use super glue if you wanted, although you'd probably need a lot of it, so the cost is probably not great. I personally use PVA glue, and I've really got quite fond of Gorilla's PVA glue. It's so super strong. It forms such a great bond, and it really is, I think, worth a little extra money. But you may not necessarily need such a strong glue in these cases. Other popular ones are things like Copydex, which is latex-based and is actually quite easy to bring up again if you make a mistake, as is a lot of PVA because it's water-soluble, so you can just wet it and that generally softens it up. There's a couple of ways you can do it. You can apply the glue sparingly to the underside of the track, making sure not to get it in any moving parts, especially with points, or you can just apply it in a thin layer to the top of the board and lay your track down on top of that. And of course, leave it the full 24 hours or overnight to fully set before coming back to do anything else. If you are using flexible track like I do, then what you'll notice is that flexible track doesn't have the allowances for rail joiners at the end of the track. When we look at the underside and we look at the more standard sort of set track, you'll notice that there are kind of these indents in the webbing at the end, allowing room for a rail joiner to slide in. When you put two bits of set track together, there's no big gap between the sleepers. It's continuous and seamless. But when you're using flexi-track, you don't have that. And so you have to account for it. Remember those sleepers from before? Well, we can now take one of those that we cut off and trim away the chair that's on top, because that will sit proud of the rail. All we need to do is slide one of these modified sleepers underneath the rail joiners. Now, this isn't a perfect solution by any means, but once we've got all the other elements down, the ballast and any other cosmetic details we add, most of it's going to blend in, and actually what you're just going to see is that continuous range of sleepers, which is going to look much better than having a massive gap in there. And of course, you can focus on getting your track laid down and come back later and add these in. There's no need to do that straight away. Okay, so on to tip number 5, and I want you to brace yourselves for this one. I'm going to ask you to paint your track. Yes, that's right. Something that we've been told for years and years to keep perfectly clean, and I'm telling you to put paint on it. And I tell you, when I discovered this was the single greatest improvement to my model railways. There's a few steps for this. First of all, I would recommend that you prime your track before you put any paint near it. Because it's plastic and metal, they're not great materials for attracting paint. So what we're going to do first is we're going to start by using a primer. And this is what I use. I use Halford's branded primer. Now, in the UK, Halfords is a motoring shop. They sell things for cars, they sell things for bicycles, camping stuff, things like that. And you may have an equivalent where you are as well. But the point is, don't necessarily rush out and get a hobby-specific primer, because in my experience, certainly with this brand, I think this is absolutely fantastic and a really good investment. Give your track a few light coats with this first. Don't be afraid to come back. Don't try and do it all in one go if it doesn't work. Turn the track as you're spraying so you can try and get most of it coated where possible. And usually, certainly with this one, it recommends leaving it 15 minutes in between coats. So even if you have to do a couple of coats to get it fully covered, that isn't going to take too much of your time. Don't rush it, because you don't want that paint pooling on the track and dripping everywhere, or causing it to clog up some of the finer details in the surface texture on the sleepers. Once we have painted our track, we're going to need to clean those rail heads. Now, for locomotives to conduct electricity, they only really need the top of the rail to be clean. Now, something else that you can use, that I use a lot, is this isopropyl alcohol, or IPA. And not the kind of IPA that you might be drinking. I wouldn't advise drinking this at all. This is a very high concentrate of alcohol, and this is something that a lot of modelers use to clean their track. Just decant some into a little pot, pop a little cotton bud in it, and I just want you to run it across the top of the rails. You may need to swap ends or use a couple of cotton buds, because you don't want to be then transferring that paint back on. Make sure you're using a relatively clean one as you go. And you should see that paint comes off pretty easily, pretty quickly, especially if you do it soon after applying the paint yourself. And for day-to-day cleaning, that's actually a really good tip as well. Okay, once your track is primed, it is ready to accept proper paint. So what I tend to use, I've used a couple of approaches in the past. One of those is to use another spray paint for the next colour. Now, one I have tried is this little Revel can here. This is 34146, and it's called NATO Olive. And it's a kind of grimy brown, really. Now, I wouldn't get hung up too much on specific colours. If you can't find this exact brand and this exact colour, it doesn't really matter. You're really looking for something that looks a bit kind of browny grey, a bit grimy. There's no exact science to the colour of dirt. And also, one really good piece of advice is to go out, if you can, if what you're modelling exists in the current day, and have a look at real examples. Now, I have to admit these days to actually using these little tester pots that you can get in DIY stores. This is from B&Q, which is our major DIY store in the UK, certainly where I live, and this cost about £1. That's nothing. That's nothing for 50 mils of paint. When you compare that to something like this, which is an actual pot of hobby paint, this is 14 mils, so that is, what was that, 50? Oh, it's quite a bit less. That would be quite a bit more. You're probably looking at £3 or £4 for something like this, when this is about £1. So a really good investment. And it's still acrylic paint. It still goes on in a similar way, and it does have a little bit more texture to it. So for buildings and things like that and scenic items, I find this really fantastic stuff. And you can get it in a wide range of different colours. There's loads of different greys and browns and creams and all sorts of more like primary colours as well. So what I've actually done is I've made myself a sleeper grime mixer pot by mixing together those different paints. Now, I don't know how well I've done. It's not far off. Obviously, the paint doesn't dry in exactly the way it looks in the tin, and also the colour that you get on the top as well is often not really the colour you actually get. So it's best to buy a few and experiment, maybe dab some on a bit of card and see how they dry and see if you actually like it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take some of this paint and we're going to put a bit on our brush and we're going to just brush it all over the track. We don't want to lather it up and make it really thick, but just enough so that the paint covers. And one thing you'll find about this household emulsion is that it sticks really well to the primer, so you don't need much on your brush at all. Just keep brushing, make sure you get it from all angles, maybe even use the brush to sort of stipple it and dab it in to some of the places where it can't fit too easily. And what I've done is I've actually come back and I've put another coat of the grime colour over the top, because I didn't feel like the first coat actually really took hold properly and it looked a bit thin. So I've made sure to put a second coat over, which again, with these paints, they dry really quickly. You can do that pretty soon after the first coat, really. But ensuring it's all fully dry, the next stage is to get a much lighter colour. And in this case, I've used almost a white, really, a kind of off-white, very pale grey maybe. And I'm going to do something called dry brushing. And that's where I load up my brush and then I wipe most of the paint off on something like a bit of blue towel. And what I'm looking for is when I brush my brush over the towel, barely any paint comes off. Now you might say, well, what's the point in that then? Well, dry brushing is a technique which leaves only the slightest trace of paint on the surface. And using the right kind of brush strokes, very gently, usually at opposite angles to any of the detail, you will find that the paint does come off and it does stick to raised surfaces and edges. You can just see the paint sticking to the edges of the sleepers, picking out some of that detail in the individual planks as well and highlighting the edges. And what I think this does is gives us that kind of pale appearance that a lot of wooden sleepers certainly have, whilst also maintaining some of the depth of colour underneath as well. And I think this looks really quite nice. Once again, after we've finished our dry brushing section, we may want to run a cotton bud over the top of the rails to just get rid of any paint that may have got on there as well. Remember to try and keep it as clean as you can. Now you can clean up dried paint later on, but it is going to be much harder when it is dry. So try and clean up as you go and keep those rail tops nice and shiny. The next bit we're going to do is to apply a rusty brown to the sides of the rails. Now again, if you go out in real life and you look at any railway line, you will notice, as well as a large amount of weathering on the track, the sides of the rails do get quite rusty, even if the tops of them are really shiny from repeated use. And we're not going to use a really bright orange rust on this, because we're kind of suggesting that as well as being rusty, these tracks are also quite dirty, and that rust is also not as fresh. For this I am using an actual hobby paint. I've got some brown, of which I've mixed in a little bit of orange to try and just lighten it up a little bit, because the original brown was a little bit too dark for my liking. And I'm just going to use a small brush and paint as carefully as I can down the sides of those rails. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to come back and I'm going to put some little daubs of paint on top of the chairs, which are the metal structures which hold the rails onto the sleepers themselves, because of course they would rust too. Tip number 6 is going to be all about adding ballast. And I know ballast is an absolutely feared element of model railways that everyone hates doing. It's long, it's arduous, it's boring, and it can also be really difficult if you haven't done it before or if you haven't got the right techniques. And I'm going to show you some techniques that have worked for me time and time again. The first thing when putting ballast down is your ballast choice. And a lot of ballast that is marketed for 00 is actually really overscale. I'm using legacy ballast from, I think I bought this from the DCC Concepts website. It says legacymodels.co.uk on here. But this looks to my eye to be actually quite accurate for 00 scale. And I think it's very tempting to go for a much bigger ballast size because for some reason it just kind of looks right to our eyes. But really, ballast is tiny. I mean, if you think about a little 00 gauge person's hand, a bit of ballast is going to sit in the middle of your palm. It's not going to engulf your entire hand. And yet, if you look at most ballast chips on model railways, they're going to be bigger than a little 00 gauge person's head. So picking something as fine as you can is definitely going to pay dividends with the overall look. You can go for a grade lower. If you're modelling in 00 or HO, aim for something aimed at N gauge. Some modelers even use sand, so natural sand from the beach. So I'm going to take a spoon and I'm going to very carefully dribble some of this ballast all over the track. And the key is to not dump too much on it. You can spread it around, but honestly, putting a little on first and then adding it gently is much easier as you go along. Get a nice wide soft brush and use it to tamp the ballast down or brush it gently back into place. This part of the process is really all about making sure that you get it looking just perfect, because hopefully, with a bit of luck, this ballast is going to stay exactly where we put it, and this is how it's going to look when it's finished. Don't overfill the track either. Ballast very rarely comes right up to the top of the sleepers, so if you can put a really small amount in there, you'll also really improve the look of your track as well. Try not to get any on top of the sleepers or on the sides of the rails or anywhere where you don't want it, although in the real world ballast does jump around and sometimes you will find little bits on the sleepers, so it's probably not the end of the world if that does happen. Try and have a nice consistent ballast shoulder along the sides as well, but it doesn't matter if this wanders off, because again in the real world we're going to have grass, we're going to have weeds, we're going to have ballast that moves around. And the other thing with ballast is that depending on the type of line that you're modelling, it could be vastly different. A tiny little branch line like I'm modelling is going to have completely different ballast to a modern day main line that is running today. So again, that's another reason to go out and look at the real thing where you can, or find pictures online or in books. Well, now we've got our ballast down, and one of the trickiest parts of this process is keeping it there. And when I started modelling, I would apply the glue and it would start to ball up and gloop away, and it would drag the ballast with it, and all of that preparation was ultimately for nothing. So I'm going to show you some methods for keeping that ballast down and staying there until it dries. And I'm going to come back to that isopropyl alcohol again. And this is fantastic stuff for loads of different reasons. I've decanted some into a little spray bottle. And what I've done is I've used that to spray liberally all over the track and the ballast. And I want to see it soak in. I want to see that ballast change to a darker colour and know that it has been quite saturated by the IPA. But also it will evaporate really super quickly. So you may want to do this in sections. And if you see the ballast turning back to its original lighter colour, you may want to top up the IPA that you've put on it. Now what the IPA does, it breaks the surface tension. And what that means is it now allows the glue to penetrate all of those little bits of substrate. And it means it will soak into the ballast instead of going all gloopy and weird on top. Now, this is only the beginning. We're going to need a proper glue mixture. We can't just put neat PVA straight on top of this, even with the IPA on top. So what I recommend is using a glue mixture made from Mod Podge. Now, this is a kind of sealer. It's really a type of PVA, but Mod Podge is brilliant, especially if you make sure you get the matte version. It dries matte, and it really does dry matte. And I found with some PVAs, they are really inconsistent. They might dry kind of matte, but kind of satin sometimes, even almost gloss, depending on which one you get. And in some cases, they also dry off colour as well. But I've had perfect results with Mod Podge, and I definitely recommend it. I'm actually going to recommend you watch a video from Boulder Creek Railroad because it's a fantastic mixture and it works every single time for me. So this is my ballast glue. This is also my scenic glue, because the same way that you use this to attach ballast, this is absolutely perfect for other scenic substrates like powders that you might put down to simulate earth and things like that. So take something like a pipette or load some of that glue mixture up into one of those spray bottles I showed earlier, because that works really well as well. And what you're going to do is you're now going to apply this glue to your freshly IPA'd track. Obviously, you're not going to apply the IPA, make your glue mixture and come back. Do all of these in the proper order. And what I look for is I really want to see the glue seeping into the ballast. And that means that I want to see the ballast turning a kind of milky white. I want to see that glue sitting in there, because that's how I know the glue has permeated the ballast properly. I would definitely recommend waiting the full 24 hours, even if your particular glue says that it dries quicker. We don't want to disturb it at any point. And this is a really, really important point, because I don't want you to touch that. I do not want you to touch that ballast at all. Resist the urge. If you look at it and you go, oh my goodness, there's one grain out of place, don't touch it. Honestly, don't touch it, because that stuff will stick to you, and you might get a cocktail stick or a cotton bud and think, I'm just gonna poke it back into place. Don't do it, because it will all stick and it will all start pulling it away. I've done this so many times and I've regretted it every time. Once you've put that glue down, leave it and walk away. Wait until it's dry. You can fix a lot more problems than you think after it has dried. Okay, we've waited the full 24 hours. We come back, we look at our track, and this is what it looks like. And I think you can agree, looking at these close-ups, that this is a big improvement over the track that we started with. The sleeper spacing has made such a difference to this Code 100 track. The painting, the dry brushing has brought out a lot of the detail that's here. And I think it's surprising to see how much detail there is in this cheapest and most basic of track work. Code 100 track kind of gets a bit of a bad time, because people think it's the simplest, it's the most basic version of track, and it kind of is, but it's still perfectly valid. Look at what we've been able to do with just a little bit of extra effort. And this is a process that I complete with all of my model railways now. I don't lay any track without making sure it's painted. I won't always change the spacing of the sleepers, and it is a lot harder when you're working with set track, especially with curves, although it is possible. But definitely painting it and ballasting like this really makes a massive difference. So I really hope that you found something useful in this video. Now, you may take all of these tips away, you may take only one or two, you may decide that none of this is worth your time. That's fine as well. But in this hobby, we're always learning, we're always growing, and we're doing that process through each other. There's lots of different things that we can all pass on to each other and learn from. And I think that's the wonderful thing about this hobby. And what I wanted to do with this series as well was to show that things that you might consider to be too basic, too old, things you've grown out of that were from maybe your childhood days of modelling, they might still have a place. There's a lot of waste in this world, and I think there's a lot of things that actually we could make use of rather than just automatically throwing them out. I really want to use these videos as well to model along with you and to show you my process and to have you join me, and hopefully together we'll learn some new things about creating tiny model worlds. This series will continue. I don't know exactly what the next video will contain, but keep an eye out for it, and that is when I will see you again. So thanks so much for watching, and take care.